Leicestershire's worst mining disaster occurred in number 5 pit at Whitwick Colliery, which went below ground where Morrison's car park now is. The fire occurred in the upper main seam. This coal was drawn up at number 5 shaft, which was 8 feet in diameter and 249 yards deep. The ventilation for this seam was produced by a fan, and the air was drawn down this shaft. This mine was worked with open flame lights as there was no fire damp and explosive methane gas here. This was a dry, dusty pit that had worked for 60 years, and the disaster was the result of a coal fire, a fire caused by spontaneous combustion in the waste coal, which started during the night shift. The night shift carried out repairs to the roadways as well as working the seams, and 42 men were underground that night, including a boy of 13, John Albert G. At about 2:30 a.m. on the morning of Tuesday, April the 19th, 1898, Joseph Lim, the deputy in charge of the night shift, was travelling down number 88 bank when he found smoke passing along the intake and main roadway. He sent a boy to tell all the men to make their way out along the return airway, and he went to investigate. As he approached the bottom of number 47 bank, the smoke was getting much worse. He got far enough to see the timbers of the main road were on fire. The fire spread through the timbers at an alarming rate, drawn by the airflow from the fan in the next shaft. It was pulling smoke and fumes towards the trapped men. The smell of these fumes and the pale blue smoke were remembered by those assembled on the pit bank for the rest of their lives. By the time Mr. Lim returned to the main road, some of the main timbers had burned through and fallen onto the roadway. Some men had managed to get under the burning timbers and were passed out on the floor, and it was obvious the fire would have to be extinguished before they could reach the workmen. Help soon arrived, but they couldn't put out the blaze. Soon the timbers gave way and there was a heavy roof fall which completely blocked the roadway. At 3:15 in the afternoon, men were down the mine desperately trying to clear the blocked road and throwing buckets of water on the burning timbers. By 6:15, a double-handed pump and hose was brought. This was more effective at putting out the fire, but any gains made were lost by the heat and steam, which was causing further roof falls. The men worked for 18 solid hours and gained just 4 feet. The officials came to the conclusion that any attempts to push through the fire would be futile. To enter the return airway at the boxhole would have been fatal due to the huge levels of carbon monoxide. The men beyond were caught in a death trap. A wall was started to contain the fire. At 8 a.m. the next morning, 16 mine officials from all around the area met together and decided that the explosions and falls were now a danger to any rescuers. After a long meeting detailing the situation, each official was asked 2 questions. 1. Is it probable any person is alive beyond the seat of the fire? They all answered in turn, no. 2. Is it possible for any person to be alive beyond the seat of the fire? Once more, all said no. After this, the dam was completed to cut the air off to the fire with pipes in it for the airflow. Another dam was built 5 yards further back to absorb any explosion that might occur, with a glass observation window. And at 2 p.m. on Thursday the 21st, the air was gently reversed. Everyone left the mine except for those watching and reporting on the fire. There was no explosion. The alarm had been sounded on the morning of the disaster, and there were hundreds of volunteers and anxious family members at the pit head. Dr. Burkitt of Whitwick and his assistant Dr. Griffin were among the first to get there. Dr. Burkitt stayed throughout the rescue process and was the only GP who would go down the mine. By 11 a.m. on Friday, the party of volunteers were around 120 strong, and they could go down in the double-decker cage 10 at a time. And then exhausted men could come back above ground, and others replaced them in the attempt to retrieve the men lost. They worked in awful conditions, using the return airway, which was very narrow and its sides were coated with tar. Many of them suffered serious skin burns and scarring from the tar and had breathing problems for the rest of their lives. They brought 9 bodies back to the surface. 24 men had not been recovered. The first report of the missing listed 34 men. This was prepared from the tallies in the tally room, but later that afternoon a tally was found that had fallen on the floor. Altogether 35 men and boys were lost. Many were related to each other or close neighbours. Most of the miners were trapped working beyond the fire, and there were only 7 survivors. Mr. George Greasley, a survivor, tried to carry his father from the blaze, but he was pulled from his arms by other semi-conscious men on the floor, and he had to leave him. The victims died of suffocation as a result of carbon monoxide poisoning. Attempts were made to recover the bodies, but 12 remain underground. The tragedy left 27 widows and 84 children under the age of 13, but a further 5 children were born to the widows who were expecting at the time of the disaster. 150 medals were struck to honour those who risked their lives to try to save the men. They eventually limited it to those who were there on the Friday, as there were more than 1,000 involved in the rescue, but the village couldn't afford any more medals. John Colledge, my great-great-grandfather and the union man, tried to get the colliery to pay for them, but they refused. 35 wage earners had been lost. There was no money. Many local shopkeepers gave the families 12 months' credit. The colliery paid for the funerals, but would not pay the extra £10 for a headstone. Mr. Bryers, the undertaker, set up payment plans for the families who couldn't afford a headstone. Walter Moss, the builders, took all their workers off house building to make 35 coffins of best elm with brass fittings, and friends and neighbours made sure family members had black clothes for the funeral procession. 20,000 people lined the streets for the main funeral procession. The colliery paid just £35 to all the families. When told they ought to pay £900, the owners said they would close the mine and declare bankruptcy. A central relief fund was set up and raised nearly £10,000. Each widow received 2 shillings and 6pence a week, 12.5 pence, and 1 shilling and 3pence, 6pence per child. But if she remarried, the payments stopped. In February 1898, just 2 months before the disaster, the mine owners had decided not to insure Whitwick Pit, as it was a safe mine with experienced managers and they could save on expensive premiums. They set aside the sum of £500 to cover any potential claims. The Miners' Fatal Accident Society took the colliery to court and wanted 3 years' wages or £300, whichever was greater. But the Workmen's Compensation Act of 1897 didn't come into force until August 1898, so the families missed out by 3 months. The mine owners were the wealthiest families in this area. We should remember that local prosperity was earned with the lives of good men. Before records had to be kept, an average of 1 man a month died in local mines. There were 42 men in the pit, 39 of whom were beyond the fire, which was discovered by Deputy Joseph Lim. 5 managed to escape through another access tunnel. 1 returned to try and rescue his comrades, stuck behind the fire. He died trying to reach them. The youngest to die in the disaster was John Albert G, aged 13. The oldest, William Bradshaw, aged 63. Albert G's body was only recovered some months later, and his official burial was on the 11th of January 1899. He was employed as a driver of the pit ponies. There follows a full list of those who died in the disaster. William T. Belcher, aged 31. John Skellington, aged 41. Thomas Beniston, 43. William Bostock, 47. William Bradshaw, 63. Josiah Brooks, 40. Charles B. Clamp, 27. J. James Davis, 28. William Davis, 30. Edward Edwards, 27. John Elliott, 43. James Evans, 57. J. Albert G, 13. Thomas Greasley, 29. William Greasley, 60. Joseph King, 29. William Lim, 30. William C. Moon, 30. John Moore, 46. Patrick O'Mara, 45. William Percival, 28. John W. Platts, 23. John Richards, 30. Joseph Shaw, 24. Louis E. Smith, 24. Henry Springthorpe, 45. Samuel Stacey, 26. William Stacey, 24. Thomas Timson, 36. John W. Tugby, 16. Benjamin Warman, 51. Joseph Wilson, 43. James Wright, 30. Henry Wyatt, 41. And James Wyatt, 35. God bless them all.